and what they can do together to try and combat what is happening, and perhaps also put your finger on what the real problem is.
So we know what the real problem is, right? And we can reduce it to one word, and that's Pakistan, right? So whether we're looking at the slaughter of tens of thousands of Afghans, as well as Americans and our Afghan and NATO partners, whether we're looking at the thousands of Indians that have been killed, or even the destabilization in Bangladesh. And to be blunt, the people who are dying in Pakistan, this is all very predictable fallout from Pakistan's preference to use terrorists under their nuclear umbrella as a principal tool of foreign policy. So I'm going to focus, I think, upon some of the things that maybe India should be considering. And the reason why I say that is that with the incoming president, whose name shall not be mentioned by me, it's not clear what the South Asia policy is going to be. Had Secretary Clinton prevailed, it would have been fairly easy to suggest some kind of policy continuity, although I would have suggested that she would have been tougher on Pakistan because she understood the Pakistani problem. Remember, she was the only Secretary of State to say very clearly to Pakistanis on Pakistani soil that, you've been raising snakes with the expectation that they only kill your neighbor, and guess what? They're killing you too. So I think I'm going to focus upon some of the internal debates that I've seen in India. And I think it's important to understand what the task is. Toby Dalton and George Perkovich wrote a really lovely book, but it was premised upon a statement that was fundamentally false. And then that throws into question the utility of the entire exercise. What Dalton and Perkovich argued was that India's task is to compel organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba to stop attacking India. Now that's a preposterous formulation of the problem. India's real problem is how does it compel the Pakistani state, and in particular the army and the ISI, to stop relying upon terrorism under its nuclear umbrella as a tool of foreign policy. So you can see that the articulations of these problems are really quite different. One will have to ask Dalton and Perkovich why they chose such an exculpatory frame when the real problem is so much more obvious. And the reason why Pakistan does this, I think it's useful to state the obvious. First, and this is the subject of the book that I'm working on right now on Lashkar-e-Taiba, they are really cheap to use. So when you look at the attributes of a Lashkar-e-Taiba activist, in terms of their human capital endowments, they're somewhere between a junior non-commissioned officer and someone that could get into the Pakistani military academy. Yet the average amount of time that they'll spend on the payrolls of Lashkar is about 7 years, right? And the Army, of course, is a womb-to-tomb organization, so you could sort of amortize the cost of what it would cost to pay for a comparable person in uniform. And no one really knows, how much Lashkar's operating costs are, but the estimates are about anywhere between, a couple of million, right? The estimates, I don't even think it's reasonable to give a number because they're based upon such hocus pocus math. But let's just say that it's 5 million, right? Pakistan's annual defense budget is 7.4 billion, right? So this is literally a drop in the bucket. And secondly, no matter how robust India's counterintelligence and counterterrorism and counterinfiltrations are, it's impossible to stop them all, right? And once they're in, they're capable of engaging in really brutal activities that if you sort of understand Pakistan's objectives, it's never going to wrest Kashmir away from India. But what these attacks do is that they put the so-called India-Pakistan dispute, which is how it's always framed in the media and by countries like the United States, and this legitimizes Pakistan's claim that there is a dispute, right? So I've argued elsewhere that we need to think about this language very differently and stop hyphenating the dispute and really talk about Pakistan's obsession with India, because India is the status quo power in this situation. So whenever there is one of these attacks, the usual suspects although the United States behaved very differently after Uri. The usual suspects call for dialogue, right? This goes right into Pakistan's narrative that there's something to dialogue about. So there's really no way you can chop this problem up that doesn't redound to Pakistan's advantage. And the reason why I would argue it redounds to Pakistan's advantage is that there's always some plausible deniability, no matter how implausible that deniability is. And neither India nor any of its partners, and I'm going to say this as an American, we have been most culpable. And anyone who thought that the Trump administration was going to sing to India's tune, I hope you looked at General Mattis's statement, where he said very clearly that conditioning military aid to Pakistan hasn't worked, so let's try not conditioning the aid. Now, his statement is really quite astonishing because it shows a complete ignorance of the problem set. The problem is not that we conditioned aid. The problem is that we had rules to condition security assistance, and we waived them. So in principle, a very small amount of assistance was actually conditioned. So we don't actually know what conditioning aid looked like because we never actually tried it. So I hope that General Mattis actually does his homework before making this region more dangerous than not. So that's just the bottom line. So what can India do to impose costs upon Pakistan? And I think it's useful, again, to state what the problem set is. So let's take Uri, for example. If you're going to actually compel Pakistan to cease and desist, you can't simply think in terms of the one-time response, right? So anyone who's done game theory knows that a proper compellant threat is that when you sum up all of the moves of the game, the costs that you've imposed upon your adversary are greater than the cost that you have in fact borne to impose those costs. Now, it's up to India and your classified community to actually do the math on whether or not the way in which you responded to Uri was a compellant strategy that was successful. I suspect by the time we add up the moves, it probably doesn't rise to that definition. So if you look at the suite of options that India has, ranging from military operations other than war all the way to full-scale war, India's options are not terribly appealing. The Perkovich and Dalton book, I think what does a really good job of is sort of going through what are India's numerous impediments to having a full-scale war with Pakistan. And I'm not going to rehearse them here, because even though they disingenuously misframe the problem, I think that their bureaucratic assessment of what India's capabilities are right now, I think are actually fairly spot on, and bravely so. So what I'm going to argue is that India needs to think about sub-conventional deterrence. And I don't see a lot of debates about this. And it's actually quite interesting that Pakistan has been using this nuclear coercive strategy, in other words, sending terrorists into India under its nuclear umbrella, with impunity. But presumably, India's nuclear umbrella confers some kind of immunity to it, right? Now, we know the history of India's covert operations. It did exist for a while, and then under Gujranwala, for a variety of reasons, it ceased to exist. And getting those operators reconstituted is a very, very onerous task, especially since if we go by the open source reporting, these contacts that India had cultivated were very, on a short-term basis, told, thank you very much, we're not going to be using your services anymore. So these are the kinds of investments that are very difficult to cultivate, and especially after letting them go without a lot of notice, it may be very difficult to build trust again and rebuild those assets. But this is something I think India really needs to think about, is really focusing on the sub-conventional possibilities while these larger military debates are being floated out. So let me tell you what's probably not a good idea on the sub-conventional spectrum. I've been watching over the last year or so a lot of flirtation with the Baloch militants. It's appealing. It looks like low-hanging fruit. They're practically coming to you begging, right? But let me tell you why it's a bad idea. The different Baloch militant groups, they are very undisciplined. They're basically personality cults that don't work well together. The idea of cooperating seems impossible, and they're not disciplined. So leave aside the fact that they don't work together. As groups, they are not disciplined. My principal objection to them is that they kill civilians. They kill Punjabi teachers. Without those Punjabi teachers, there would be no teachers in Balochistan. And so what India has had to its advantage is a relatively pristine record of not reciprocating the kinds of things that Pakistan does. So this would probably not redound to India's advantage to be supporting groups like this. Supporting groups like the Pakistan Taliban, the TTP, also has a lot of risks for blowback, right? So these are Deobandi organizations. Shuru say they came from groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji, Huwaham, that whole alphabet soup of organizations that cut their teeth targeting India, right? So there could be very big negative externalities for India to be encouraging groups like the TTP because they have these very tight linkages with groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed that the Pakistani state is rehabilitating to kill Indians again. And I can talk more about that, but the reason why the Pakistani state has been so interested in recuperating Jaish-e-Mohammed is it's been part of their strategy of peeling away, or if you will, a Garvapasi program for those Deobandi Pakistan Talibs that don't want to go fight in Afghanistan. They might be Garvapasied back into Jaish to go and kill India. And of course, those that can't be Garvapasied into either of these good militant groups are the folks that they then focus upon with military operations. So neither the Baloch nor the TTP, I would argue, are sensible targets to go after as a part of an asymmetric strategy. So what are things that are doable? So one of the things that I've concluded from my Lashkar-e-Taiba book that I'm finishing is that there's a loveliness to LET's hierarchical structure. And if you read my colleague Jacob Shapiro's book called The Terrorist Dilemma, he makes a number of fascinating conclusions based around how an organization is targeted. So it won't surprise you that organizations are hierarchically organized like this only do so when they have a safe environment, right? So when you have organizations like, for example, the TTP, that have an unsafe environment, they have a networked organization with these overlapping nodes. And the reason is you can take out one node and the rest of the organization doesn't fall. Jaish-e-Mohammed, as far as we can tell, also has a similarly personality-driven, hierarchical organizational nature because it presumes a safe environment, because these hierarchical organizations can only operate in safe environments. Well, this is great from a targeting perspective. If you look at LET's leadership, you've got about 10 dudes that have circulated through most of these posts. So I'm going to suggest that India should probably focus its interests or focus its efforts in cultivating capabilities for leadership decapitation. So there's a lot of literature that says, oh no, don't do this, don't kill leaders. Well, that literature is misunderstood, and also it's been misunderstood by Perkovich and Dalton. That literature pertains to leadership decapitation with a group with which you actually want to negotiate, right? So if you want to negotiate with a group, it makes sense that you don't kill their leadership because they're the ones that can actually control the production of violence. It's principal agent theory 101. But you're never going to negotiate with LET or Jaish-e-Mohammed. So that literature, which Toby, Dalton, and George Perkovich mobilize, I think disingenuously, because it's pretty clear if you read those articles what they're talking about, this literature doesn't apply. So I've argued in a piece that I've written for ORF and the publication that's available, that these are the kinds of things that India should be focusing on, is how do you develop the capabilities within Pakistan to take out these core leaders. Because in groups like LET and Jaish, you can disable the organization. And what's fascinating is because they operate with such impunity and they take for granted the amenities of the state, they haven't developed any bench depth, right? So one of the things that we've seen with the targeting of Al-Qaeda in the TTP as you eliminate these mid-level operators, I mean, they're really going to like the dregs of the organization. And as they have to pull in increasingly less competent and ever more duffers into the organization, their ability to be competent really declines. So I'm going to put that out there, that that's something that India should be thinking about. Let me also turn to something, and then finishing up, let me also just put something on the table. Once these guys are in, it becomes the task of law enforcement. And there's been enough ink spilled on police reform in this country. I don't need to recuperate or reiterate those debates, and we all know why police reform is stalled here, right? Politicians here like to use the police as their personal, euphemistically, facilitators. But one of the things that I've observed, like for example, in Kashmir, failure to have modern police has strategic implications for the military. So I'm going to submit to you, and then I'm going to shut up, that you need to really get this police issue sorted out. If you're not going to sort it out nationally, you need to sort it out in places that are of strategic importance. So the Pakistanis understand your dilemma, and they exploit it, right? As long as they're sending terrorists over, you can't pull out the counterinsurgency grid. But it's really cheap to pay a grandmother or a child, and that was their innovation this summer, right? To give them 500 rupees, they'll throw a stone, provoke a police officer. Pakistan only loves Kashmiris when they're dead. We understand this. But once they kill a kid or a grandmother, things, as they say, the tatiyan meets the punka. So, and I'm going to suggest that it's not a helpful strategy to look for the new non-lethal munition, because there is no such thing as a non-lethal munitions. You should have learned this from the Israelis. What you need to think about is crowd control. And don't take this from my country. We're killing black people, like it's open season. So I'm not going to suggest anyone look at my policing. I think there are European police that manage enormous crowds, right? And no one is ever killed. So I'm going to submit to you that you need to get this police issue under control. They need to be properly trained. Bamboo shields is probably not kind of effective crowd control, because by the time you have a police officer cowering behind his sandbags, the battle's been lost. Someone is going to get shot, right? So I'm going to end on a plea, a very serious plea, that folks who are sitting in state assemblies and in national assemblies take this policing very, very seriously. Because it doesn't matter how good your military is. Once they're in, this is your point of vulnerability. And as long as you have this point of vulnerability, the Pakistanis are going to exploit it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. As usual, compelling, difficult to sum up. Everything you said, unexceptionable. And finally call Amrullah Saleh, the former NDS director, a man who has fought against terrorism, perhaps one of the most clear-headed analysts on what terrorism is all about and what you need to do to combat it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I thank ORF and the government of India for inviting me to this conference. When Mr. Sarin asked me how do I want to speak, I said I want to be the mullah of the panel, speaking last and praying success for everyone. And so that's what I do. Last time when I was in the same panel with Dr. Christine Fair, I offered her Afghan citizenship. This time I am offering her a special advisory role in our special forces. So she should teach them how to decapacitate these heads and leaders. We have not neutralized a lot of them. I echo and share the perspective largely of what has already been said, and it has been a very comprehensive conference, and I know this is the last panel, and the appetite for deep discussion is naturally shouldn't be there. So I want to be very brief and broad about the situation in my country as the largest victim of terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism in the region. I was in another conference in much more detailed discussions talking about radicalization, de-radicalization, the narratives, the counter-narratives. There's a tendency to relate the ongoing problems to the concept of Islam itself, to the core of Islam, and I disagree with that narrative. I think this religion has been hijacked by a minority, to quote a journalist who I met this morning. What the terrorists want is they want an exclusive heaven and pluralistic hell. While we believe that the hell should be very small and the heaven should be very big, and that is the difference between mainstream Islam and the religion they propagate. Coming to Afghanistan, in 2016 our forces were very successful despite the fact that a big void was left by departing international forces. They managed to keep the Taliban at bay, and they managed to keep the big population centers, communication lines. There were setbacks, but the Taliban and the Pakistan calculation proved wrong, that they will lose a big chunk of territory, and that the Quetta Shura can be moved into Afghanistan. The Quetta Shura is still Quetta Shura, and as far as I understand, the new leader of the Taliban actually does not live in Quetta, he lives in Lahore. When we are saying nanostate actors, in reality we abstract our analysis of what is going on. To imply that nanostate actors can have access to cash, to sophisticated explosive devices, and to all trade crafts of intelligence, to the art of targeting, and have a ghost army much more capable in certain skills than conventional armies, this is not right. This is a terminology, and this is a phrase we should not use. We should find another definition for it, and I don't want to elaborate more because Dr. Christine Fair was very fair on explaining the situation. Now, there's another burning question in the minds of analysts and practitioners. If the Afghan problem has not been solved to this date, can it be solved after this? And is there a peaceful way out of this, or protraction of the fight has not given the result we all wanted? You remember our president, the current one, took a huge risk, and he reached out to Pakistan Army, and he tried to find a negotiated settlement for the problem, but his good intention was not reciprocated, and Afghanistan was pushed back into a very undesirable situation. Now, what is the problem? The problem is, if I may quote former Prime Minister of India, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who said something along these lines, that states should not be judged by their statements, but by their deeds and actions. And those states who sponsor terrorism and aid terrorism should not be allowed to profess membership in the international coalition against terror. He said the war against terror can only be successful if honest states are given membership. That stands very true, although he said it many years ago, I think immediately after 9/11. We also have the resolution 1373 not implemented at all. If a fracture of the resolution 1373 had been implemented, by now a lot of Pakistani generals should have been at Hague, put on trial for committing crimes against humanity. I'm not saying this just it's a spicy statement. Last year we lost nearly 20,000 Afghans, only 8 foreigners. The fight that they term jihad and they say we are killing the infidels and non-believers is completely wrong. They are killing children, women, passengers traveling from one province to another province. They are bombing mosques. That is the reality. So those who have perpetuated, those who are behind the killing of thousands and thousands of civilians, they have committed crimes against humanity. Why Afghanistan is not in the headlines of major Western newspapers or media outlets, I don't want to go into details of that, but I think West is making a mistake of deceiving itself, thinking the problem is not there. They are going back to some degree to the narrative of late 90s that this is a containable problem. It is Afghanistan, it's local, it's not going to bite us or bite our national and core interest. That's a wrong way to look at it. Now, with that said, how do I see the future of my country and its standing in this war and its partnership with the region and beyond? One, Afghanistan has a government. With all its problems, the government is functioning and it's a viable partner of the international community, of India, and it speaks for Afghanistan and it speaks for the national interest of Afghanistan. So the message from Afghanistan is talk to that government, work with that government, help that government gain more roots and gain more strength. The Afghan National Security Forces are the most trusted and battle-hardened and tested ally of the West in this region. They have taken far more casualties than any other force in the international coalition. Then the other buzzword these days is the reconciliation, and my message is very clear that reconciliation or peace efforts or negotiations should not be Afghan-led, it should be Afghan government-led. Because what they want to do is, by calling it Afghan-led, they actually want to fragment the Afghan society, bring each little fragments to talk to the Taliban, and the cost of those efforts will be the Afghan state, the strength of the Afghan state. We should not fall into this trap. It should always be Afghan government-led. So initiatives like the one which is pursued by Pakwash is not helping Afghanistan at all. It is weakening the very entity which has been created after so much sacrifice of blood and treasure, and that is the Afghan government. Will we go back to the 90s, or some people say, will Afghanistan become another Syria? Absolutely not. The judgment about Afghanistan is based on bad news, and a lot of times the good news does not make it to the headlines. Afghanistan is a much different country than the 90s. It has an army, it has a police force, it has an intelligence force. Look, do they fail from time to time? Absolutely. Think of it this way. What if there were 3,000 Pathankot attacks in India? You will have a lot of problems. That's what we are dealing in our country. Not one Pathankot, but 10,000 Pathankot-style attacks on in our FOBs and on our army outposts here and there. And my message to India is doing a lot in Afghanistan. India has gained enormous space in the hearts and minds of the Afghan people by doing good work, investing in education, civil service, in roads, in energy, in urban development, in everything good. But as India is rising and it is pursuing the noble path of partnership, India should do more with Afghanistan, because we as Afghans and you as Indians, we have a common threat, we face common enemy. we are being bitten by the same snake. Why I disagree with the notion that there is a neighbor who is training snakes and we keep warning them not to do. They do it because they have an interest to sell snake venom, and there are buyers for this. That brings me to the conclusion of my talk. Is our humble advice to the upcoming U.S. administration is that the policy of giving aid, giving incentives to de-link Pakistan army from insurgents and from non-state actors has not worked. It is time they should have a very critical look at that policy and find the flaws in it and do not repeat something which has not worked. It has clearly not worked. United States, we and the rest of the world, the good thing is we are not operating in the void and absence of intelligence and information. The good thing today is there is massive awareness and there is understanding where the enemy is and who the enemy is. What is lacking is a strong will to go to the real problem. And it is time we break this stalemate and we do not satisfy ourselves with this bloody status quo, both bloody for us and for our allies, and do something differently. Because continuation of the status quo is going to be playing into the script of the Pakistan army, and which clearly pursues a strategy based on death by 1,000 cuts. And we know that is what they do, and we should stop it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amrullah Saleh. And I'm sure, again, not a thing one can disagree with. So we've completely run out of time, but I have the mandate to allow 3 questions. So if there is anybody, somebody needs to come up to the mic and can ask the questions. And if there's nobody, then we can go and the...
Good evening. I'm a student of politics from SOAS, London, and I want the panel to comment on the Islamic military army, which is being led by Saudi Arabia and 39 nations. And the current chief, or the new chief, would be the ex-Pakistani chief, General Raheel Sharif. So I just want the panel to comment on this. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Swarup Pandit from ORF Mumbai. I have 2 questions. One, on the one hand, when society is becoming more and more individualistic, whereas the world is actually demanding accommodative attitude, then how we are going to bridge this contrast, either ideologically, practically, or institutionally? That is my first question. The second is to Mr. Faiz, that the role and importance of healthy family system in de-radicalizing narrative. Thank you.
The second question was to whom?
Faiz. Dr. Faiz.
Okay. What was the question? The role of the family in de-radicalization.
My question is to Christine. Chris, you gave the example of how decapitation pushes up less competent people up the ladder. You have the example of Hassan Nasrallah, who came up because of an Israeli decapitation strike, who turned out to be far more venomous than his predecessor was and much, much more successful. What guarantee do we have if we decapitate that we don't actually push up a much more venomous, vicious, and more successful brand of leadership?
And I'll give the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Kugela. I'm from Polish Institute of International Affairs. It is certainly true that this is very hard to win the war on terror, to tackle this issue. But yesterday we've heard that there is one positive example. In Sri Lanka, that there was the only war on terror that was definitely won. So this statement is obviously contested, especially in the West. So I'm not going to ask the panelists do they agree with this statement, but I would like to draw this other South Asian example into the discussion and ask you what kind of lessons can we draw from war against Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka in terms of effectiveness, of legality, of productivity, and accuracy and proportionality. Thank you.
Okay, so I think...
can I ask one question?
No, I'm sorry. We're completely out of time. Just answering these questions will probably take... Boris, can you answer the last one on what has happened in Sri Lanka and the effectiveness? Professor Saab, you have a question to you, and perhaps you can answer the one on the military alliance.
No, I'm not, the military.
Decapitation.
Oh, yeah.
On military alliance, maybe Amrullah would like to answer on military alliance. So, please, Boris.
Thank you. On Sri Lanka, what we observe and that we can be happy about is that it is very rare that there is an end to a conflict, and Sri Lanka is one of those conflicts which has seen an end recently. For us as ICRC, it is important to continue the work because, as you know, during the conflict you have a lot of situation that requires from us to continue the work, namely in detention activities. All people who have been detained in the past in relation to the conflict, we continue to monitor them until either they are released or until necessary. And second, we work a lot on the issue of missing persons, people who have disappeared during the conflict. Therefore, it's very important that we support the government in their efforts to find solutions and to provide answers to the families of those who are missing. And unless these big efforts via missing commissions are done, it's difficult to go towards reconciliation as long as a number of questions post-conflict remain open.
Yes, what the Saudi government did with that project needs some explanation. It's not an Islamic army what they are doing. What the Saudi government does is understandable. They want to have influence in the Muslim world. But they are going at it in a wrong way. They have a lot of money. We have a lot of poverty in the Muslim world. They could just have a Marshall Fund of their own, like the Americans did with Europe. Spend their petrodollars on helping poor Muslims get to a better situation. Instead of doing that, unfortunately, they're funding extremism, they're funding terrorism, and they have a problem with having an army. Their security is based on the weapons they buy from the West, and unfortunately, we have some Western governments that are too happy to sell them billions of dollars of weaponry. But they really don't control these weapons. They need to get people from other countries to come and fight their wars for them, which is very, very dangerous. I don't want to go further with regard to the Saudi situation because they don't have a representative here, and I'm also fair, like our Dr. Christine Fair. So I stop there. With regard to the family being able to, the question that our brother had there, family actually does play a very important role. I think it was the McKinsey Foundation that did a study some months ago, basically pointing out to the role that the mothers and the wives of the people who engage in terrorism can do in order to identify radicalization among people who are going to engage in terrorism. Mothers and wives are closest people to the men that generally engage in these activities. And educating that segment of population actually would do a lot in terms of making sure that the route that some of these people are taking is not taken. But I think more important than that is actually teaching people, teaching Muslims, that killing other Muslims in the name of Islam, or killing other people, whether they are Muslims or not, in the name of Islam, in the manner that they are doing, is not part of Islamic teaching. The Takfiri thought, the Wahhabi thought, is not part of the Islamic teaching. And once they realize that, then the situation, I think, will be much better. Grace?
So let me first address the CVE question. So CVE is only effective in enriching Beltway bandits. Let that sink in. So why do I say that? The hubris that someone sitting in Washington or elsewhere could understand what these groups do and actually put forth some strategy to undermine it is really ridiculous. We don't even have people who speak these languages, right? We're still reliant upon interpreters. And I think the civilizational project of CVE is also kind of a joke. I keep asking my Canadian friends to please develop a CVE program for America. You may have noticed that we've become a little bit nutty. So I'm very pessimistic about CVE in general. But if we're going to talk about CVE with respect to Pakistan, then we should just go home. Because the issue is, let's just pretend that there was a fairy and she had a CVE wand, and it would work in other places. It's not going to work in Pakistan because the Pakistanis themselves continue to cultivate this ideology that this kind of violence is appropriate. So it's a Scythian task because no matter, even if there was this magical wand that let you do this, you're never going to outsmart the ISI, right? So if you look at Pakistani television, if you look at their curriculum, this is completely imbricated into the lives of Pakistanis. So CVE is a great way of getting yourself rich. USAID, DFID, they'll all pay you if you have a somewhat competent looking NGO and you can write a proposal in passable English. I think the leadership decapitation question is much more interesting. So the particular case that you cited is doubly interesting because this is a group that ostensibly the Israelis would want to negotiate with, right? So this falls into the category of bad idea. Not only do you take out the person that can calibrate violence, but you actually might throw up someone worse. Well, that's also the case that these organizations are used to replacing these leaders. So my assessment of Lashkar, and it's particularly different because they have the same 10 dudes that have been around forever, right? Hafiz Saeed is finally cultivating his successor. So there's this window of opportunity, right, to get him before his successor is fully trained. But I submit to you that there's always a possibility that these kinds of assessments are wrong. But then let's also remember who ultimately is calibrating LET's violence, right? This is not exogenous, right? They are calibrated by the ISI. So I think the argument can be made to go ahead, I think the argument can be made that you're not taking out the ISI, right? You're taking out LET. And I think this is a relatively risk-free adventure given the way that organization is staffed and structured.
I think we need to close. Thank you to the panel, cracking panel, and thank you to the audience. This is a topic which can go on, and I'm sure in Raisina 3, we can probably carry forward this conversation. So thank you all.